Hello everyone, and welcome to the next eagerly anticipated entry in the Warhammer Fantasy Q&A series. This time, featuring the long-awaited Chaos Dwarfs. There were just an obscene amount of questions about the mysterious Dawizar, as between YouTube, Discord, and Patreon, I managed to condense everyone's requests down to about 55 pages that were then further compressed to combine all related questions that were then organized into categories. This massive undertaking resulted in what stands before you. Easily the most organized and hopefully easy to follow Q&A I've ever crafted. So please relax as we begin our journey through the just absurd amount of lore that it's time to dive through. Broken into the following categories of Chaos Dwarf culture, technology, the Kadai, Bull Centaurs, bizarre questions, meta/design questions, Age of Sigmar / the End Times, Chaos Dwarfs worldwide, Hashut, warfare and battle tactics, hobgoblins, the dark lands and monsters found within, biology / anatomy, and finally, sorcerers and their magic. Thank you all so much for submitting your questions and of course your immense patience with me. A lot of research and effort went into creating this massive thing. I sincerely hope that you all will find the wait to have been well worth it. As a quick aside, every question will feature the names of those who were credited with having contributed to asking that particular question, at least in some way. Also, for those curious, the main sources used to find or understand or infer all of the information and answers found within came from the following books of Tarmakon, The Throne of Chaos, the Chaos Dwarf Army book that was published in 1994, also the Black Library books of Gotrek and Felix, The Road of Skulls, and Wolfric. Also the 8th edition Warriors of Chaos Army book, along with the 6th edition campaign supplement of the Storm of Chaos. So without further ado, let's begin our long journey into answering the many questions about the children of Hashut. Part 1. Chaos Dwarf Culture. Our first question: do the Chaos Dwarfs have the same grudge system and culture as the dwarfs? Do they still hold on to their ancestral wrongs from the likes of Greenskins? And do they have their own Dammaz Kron? When it comes to the Chaos Dwarfs, they have a relationship with their ancient kin remarkably similar to that of the Dark Elves to the High Elves, in that the Uzkul Dratzar, which is what the Chaos Dwarfs call themselves, are more of a corrupted distortion of the Dawi as opposed to an entirely unique race. The main cultural similarities that have remained between the two are those of oaths, loyalty, grudges, and kinship. The Chaos Dwarfs take grudges and oaths very seriously, keeping careful track of those who have wronged them in careful preparation for when vengeance shall be exacted. However, when it comes to specific grudges, the Chaos Dwarfs don't care for the concerns of their Western kin, even from the days when they were part of the same empire. They reserve all that pent-up hatred for the dwarfs of the World's Edge Mountains, who they believe abandoned them to die. From all the research I've put into the Chaos Dwarfs, I haven't come across anything mentioning how they maintain records of their grudges. So it is incredibly likely they have something similar to books of grudges stashed somewhere within Mingolzar Nagrund or the particular outpost in which they live. Though, knowing the brutal aesthetic of the Dawizar, they probably have some horrific monstrosity made from demonic cursed metal that keeps such records, instead of the more mundane methods used by their Western kin. Next question. What is the role of Chaos Dwarf women? Can they have other roles such as leadership or turn into Bull Centaurs? Do they parallel with how dwarf women are treated. The women of the Chaos Dwarves, known as Dames or Dames, hold a near identical position in their society to that of their Western kin. They're just as rare for an even smaller population of dwarfs, but still hold positions of dignity and are carefully protected within the capital of Minigame. Chaos Dwarf clans are organized differently in that they're all bound around one of the sorcerer prophets, who are the ultimate and only authority as the priesthood of Hashut. That being said, these Dames virtually are never spoken of outside of a note that those who are blessed, so to speak, by Hashut to give birth to Bull Centaurs rarely survive that unfortunate experience. It is incredibly likely they wield sinister power within the tiered ziggurat of Czartrajan, but one would never see battle unless defending their home against some cataclysmic invasion. If they do hold leadership roles, it's likely only within their families or clans, but of course, all within a Chaos Dwarf clan are subservient to the sorcerer prophets, and there has never been any evidence of a dam being among the sorcerer prophets, the demonsmith engineers, so to speak, or the Bull Centaurs. Our third question is, what is the Chaos Dwarf afterlife? Are there any particular funeral rites? The Chaos Dwarfs abhor weakness above all else, and those who die were clearly too weak to survive. The dead of the Dawizar are rarely treated with any reverence. The only common exception seems to be that of the sorcerer prophets, who most often are slain by their own sorceries and the curse of Hashut, resulting in their bodies turning to stone. The statues, which are rumored by some to still be alive and aware despite their petrification, are carefully enshrined upon the black road leading through the tiers of Minigame to the temple of Hashut at its zenith. But even this I would not necessarily consider a mark of respect. It's more of a mark of warning and to create as intimidating an atmosphere as possible. The Chaos Dwarves do not care for their dead and don't seem to worry about an afterlife, much in the sense that the Dark Elves don't. Because to have died means that in whatever way you have failed and are unworthy of being thought about or worshipped or concerned with in any means. Our next question is, what is the relationship between the Chaos Dwarfs and the Dark Brothers, meaning the Dark Gods? So what do the Chaos Dwarfs think of the four major powers, since they worship Hashut? The relationship between the Dark Gods and the Chaos Dwarfs is essentially the relationship they have with all other things outside of Hashut, being that the Dark Brothers are merely another tool to be utilized and taken advantage of. The Chaos Dwarfs hold no reverence for Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh. They are inferior deities worshipped by inferior peoples, the weak fools of the wider world who will be trampled beneath the iron tread of the followers of Hashut. The demons of the greater powers are used as fuel and animus for weapons, just another resource to be exploited for the glory of their own god. Next up, our question here is, what caused the creation of the Chaos Dwarfs? Why did they turn to a dark god in the first place, and when did this happen? Oh boy. So, the story of how the Chaos Dwarfs came to be is quite mysterious, and to explain it properly, I think I need to explain the history of the dwarfs themselves leading up to that tragic moment. So buckle up for a long answer. In the beginning, the Old Ones created the dwarfs in the mountains of the Southlands, at the now lost hold of Karak-Zorn. Not long afterwards, the stellar gates hanging above the northern and southern poles of the planet imploded, due to the machinations of chaos. The resultant devastation was so cataclysmic that it tore reality itself apart and opened a hole into the realm of chaos itself through which the demons of chaos spewed forth. This occurred around 5,600 years before the birth of Sigmar, which I'll refer to as BS going forward. Kind of like saying before Common Era, so to speak. For a time, the dwarves and other younger races of the world were spared from the attentions of chaos, as the world-spanning empire of the Lizardmen held against the onslaught of the demons of chaos. Yet, while the elves would not be faced by the legions of the Dark God for nearly a millennia, the brave Dawi actually started their journey north across the World's Edge Mountains in 5500 BS, aided by the immense power of the ancestor gods who walked among them. There were many dangers in this age, such as truly terrifying ancient dragons, unspeakable horrors lurking in the deepest, darkest places, and of course, the occasional manifested demons. It seems most likely that with the old ones deceased or having vanished, and the lizardmen now preoccupied fighting an endless tide of horrors, there was no one around to watch the dwarfs and the ancestor gods, and thus they were able to start their journey of migrating and populating across the world, no longer having custodians or caretakers to watch over them, so exploring their own destiny. Over the course of the next 1,000 years, the Dawi managed to carve their way north through the mountains and deep places in the earth, which led to the founding of many holds known to this day, most notably Karaz Akarak. However, the expansion of the Dwarven realm slows to a crawl, as the tides of beastmen, demons, and other corrupted creatures begin to attack more frequently and in greater numbers, as the Lizardman Empire is slowly forced further and further back. The ancestor goddess Valea, who founded most of the strongholds of the Dwarf Empire, responds to this particular threat by returning to her favorite settlement to take up permanent residence in Karaz Akarak in 4523 BS. Not long after, in 4500 BS, all hell breaks loose as the Lizardman Empire is finally crushed by the demons of chaos, and only a handful of isolated temple cities remain. With their primary opponent essentially defeated, the demons turn their predations upon the wider world, and begin to descend upon the early nations of civilization, including most notably the dwarfs and the high elves. This results in devastation across the Dwarf Empire, as holds and outposts are struggling to survive against the attentions of the demonic legions, led primarily by the Great Unclean One, Kugoth Plaguefather. Nearly every major population center is obliterated or overrun by the demons, or at the very least forced into their deepest holds against a never-ending foe, until only the Everpeak stands strong in defiance. Thus, Kugoth assaults Karaz Akarak with all his might. Utilizing clever engineering and a stubborn last stand, the dwarfs destroy the entire demonic army by setting off a series of charges that collapses part of the mountain itself on top of the Plaguefather and his legions. The demons are banished, and the Dawi remain hidden here for over a century to wait out this age of darkness. In the year 4420 BS, the ancestor god Grimnir marches north to find the origin of the demons and slay their foul gods, throwing himself against the demonic legions, which unknowingly aids the elves of Ulthuan as they attempt to complete their great ritual, which creates the Vortex. As the winds of magic are stripped out of the world and the demons cast back into the nightmarish realm from which they came, the world becomes safe enough again for the Dawi to resume expanding their empire. However, the ancestor gods vanish. Many of the dwarfs believe that they've returned to a mysterious realm hidden deep within the earth, and will return to the Dawi when needed most. For the next century, they continue to eagerly expand further and further north in the World's Edge Mountains, until at last they reach the end of that massive range. In roughly 4300 BS, the dwarfs in the cold north debate about whether to continue expanding, now that they've reached the end of the World's Edge Mountains. On the eastern edge of these far northern peaks, they discovered Zorn-Uzkul, or the Great Skull Land, a vast and inhospitable plateau where the air was frigid and thin, and the dusty ground littered with the wind-scoured bones of the ancient dead. While the land proved to be incredibly rich in mineral wealth, the dwarfs found the earth and stone to be tainted and unclean. Most of the Dawi returned south to other established holds, while the most adventurous and wild folk instead carried on north across the frozen tundra until they discovered the peaks of the land that we would come to call Norska. Others instead undertook the journey to the east and then south, founding holds among the rich lodes recently discovered in the Mountains of Morn. But some refused to back down from the challenge posed by Zorn-Uzkul. The dwarfs were the masters of stone and steel, after all. This land would yield up its riches to them as all others had before it. So, these stubborn folk marched down from the peaks and founded their new hold, Uzkulak, the place of the skull. They began to harvest the resources of this land while maintaining contact and trade with the Dawi of the World's Edge Mountains. Over the next 300 years, the dwarves of Zorn-Uzkul can't help but notice an increase in the hordes of beastmen and mortals who worship the dark powers, other signs that chaos is once more on the rise. In their stubbornness, they chose to delve deeper into the earth and continue to indulge their desire for wealth instead of fleeing back to the holds of their kin. In the year 4000 BS, the Dawi pay for their mistake, when an immense horde of hideous and mutated humans from the oft-forgotten and long-lost legendary northern tribe known as the Tong sweep down from the eastern steeps in the Chaos Wastes to attack them. Isolated as they are from the other holds, the dwarfs prepare for siege, as they're assaulted by an endless horde of human worshippers of the dark gods, bolstered further by demons and monstrous beasts, as the realms of chaos at the north of the world seem to swell outwards, almost as in response to this monstrous tide. They pray to the ancestor gods for aid against this unstoppable threat. Their only answer is silence. No matter how desperate their pleas, the dwarfs of Uzkulak find themselves abandoned in the dark, as none of their ancient rituals or ceremonies receive any response. Despair growing with each passing day, they have no choice but to seal themselves in and hope that their western kin will notice the sudden lack of contact and send a relief force. They continued to dig as the years creep by, carefully rationing their supplies and trusting in the bonds of ancestral kinship to summon rescue. 1 year passes, then 10, then 50, and no one comes. Doubt begins to seep into their minds. Surely they have not been forgotten. It slowly becomes increasingly clear that not only had their gods abandoned them, but so had their kin. No mighty throng would be marching down from the World's Edge Mountains to cast back the hordes of chaos. They were utterly alone. As the years continued to tick towards a century of being sealed beneath the earth, the starving dwarves of Uzkulak were slowly consumed by rage towards those who had left them to suffer. Their desire for vengeance, combined with their stubborn refusal to accept death, bred a truly fierce desperation within their hearts. Thus, they began to pray for deliverance, but to anything that would listen. Then came their final mistake, for the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep, discovering something in the all-consuming darkness of the furthest deeps. An entity that answered their prayers. Sometime between 3900 to 3500 BS, various sources differ on when exactly this occurs, the dwarfs found the answer to their prayers, and turned to worshipping Hashut, the father of darkness. We'll discuss him quite a bit in depth later on. From this point, the dwarfs are slowly mutated into the Chaos Dwarfs over the course of centuries, emerging once more into the world in roughly 2700 BS, when most of the Dawi Zar leave Uzkulak to found the fortress city of Mingolzar Nagrund upon the plain of Zar, down within the Darklands proper, which is raised from the earth as a dark iron and black obsidian ziggurat solely by the foul sorceries of the mightiest sorcerer prophets of Hashut. Thus begins the saga of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. I do want to make a quick note for those who may have noticed that the official timeline is at odds with the descriptions used by the various authors that talk about how the Chaos Dwarfs came about. Very bizarrely, one thing I have noticed in many of my readings is that, with one exception, the writers would often claim that the initial tides of chaos unleashed during the Great Cataclysm is what isolated and doomed the Chaos Dwarfs, despite the fact that the exact same books very clearly show that Zorn-Uzkul wasn't even discovered until after the vortex had been created and the demons of chaos cast back into the far north, which are thousands of years apart. So, I did my best to tell the story to fit the given official timelines while still keeping the core events of the story intact. Honestly, the closest in a way to a story that makes sense within the timeline is that discovered within the Tome of Corruption from the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. However, it has other significant issues with the more modern Chaos Dwarf lore. However, it does make the most sense that the force that likely attacked Zorn-Uzkul and Uzkulak was not actually a tide of demons, because that doesn't fit the timeline at all, but instead was the Tong, who are a very significantly powerful chaos tribe that in the modern age of Warhammer Fantasy have all but vanished from the world. They were noted as essentially being the most deadly of the Marauder northern tribes to ever exist. For those of you that are very familiar with, say, Warrior of Chaos or Norscan lore, the Kurgan are often represented as the big bads of the three major tribes, being the Norskins, the Kurgan, and the Hung, while the Tong are like an entire tier above the Kurgan. These guys were noted as being the most hideous, the most mutated, the most bloodthirsty and deadly of all the tribes because they were completely suicidal. They did not believe in anything other than violence and death and would throw themselves unrestrained into battle and would keep fighting until they died or the enemy was dead. They didn't have a concept of retreat, and they were often very dangerous and deadly to even other tribes. However, one of their earliest achievements was battling the dwarves of Uzkulak and beating them back quite thoroughly and surrounding them, at least credited in the Tome of Corruption, which, considering that all of the other books that talk about the history of the Chaos Dwarves instead only use very mysterious terminology as to what actual force attacked them, I would credit this as making the most sense. That after the Vortex was created, the Realm of Chaos, of course, is able to expand outwards should there be a strong enough force of Chaos worshippers essentially dragging it south through acts of violence and profane ritual. likely came down in a massive horde as one of their first major invasions of the south. They found Uzkalak, they laid siege to it with many horrific monsters such as Chaos Trolls and Manticores and Chimera, and because of their acts and their victories, they dragged the realm of chaos itself further south, which allowed demons to manifest, and the dwarfs of Uzkalak were utterly doomed, especially because the dwarfs of the west may not have really realized how dangerous of a threat they were under until it was too late. And the dwarves of the west, and even those within the Mountains of Morn, would only look out and see a colossal tide of dark worshippers and think that surely their kin were doomed, and there was no reason to go out as they had not heard from them in centuries, and thus just accepted that they were dead and lost, which led to the creation of the Chaos Dwarfs. The struggles of a Warhammer Fantasy lore master, huh? Trying to piece together 35 plus years of lore from all sorts of different authors who don't check each other's work. In any event, that's the end of that question, so let's move on. Our last question for today, as we will be keeping to a roughly 30-minute schedule on each episode, is the following. Do Chaos Dwarfs have the equivalent of Slayers? If so, how do they work? They do. Indeed, there's an elite form of heavily armored infantry known as the Infernal Guard. The culture of the Chaos Dwarves is incredibly unforgiving and ruthless, which means that it is not terribly uncommon for one of the Dawizar to become stained by dishonor or failure. This can be for straightforward sins, such as being defeated in battle under the attention of a sorcerer prophet, presiding over slaves who rebelled, or tending to some furnace or war machine that exploded. It is also quite possible to suffer from just being related to such an event. For instance, being kin to a failed military commander can put a stain upon your honor. When such an instance occurs, the Chaos Dwarfs who bear this shame will enlist into the Infernal Guard of the Black Fortress. For to do so results in being declared dead in the eyes of Hashut, providing the solace found in anonymity. As part of the initiation ritual, the Chaos Dwarf in question will have all ties to their name and kin erased, their face seared and shut beneath red-hot iron and bronze masks. Now inducted into the Infernal Guard, they live only to serve the Lord of the Black Fortress's will, and stubbornly sacrifice their lives to protect the Black Fortress itself from any who would dare assault it. From this point on, they live in the barracks in the burning deeps beneath the Black Fortress, training endlessly under the cruel gaze of their castellans to battle the endless horrors of the Darklands. There is virtually endless battle raging around the Black Fortress due to countless monsters, tides of greenskins and ogres, and regular attacks upon the fortress itself. Only the strong will survive. Those who prove themselves worthy can eventually be elevated to the rank of Infernal Ironsworn, who act as the personal bodyguard to the sorcerer prophets that make up the ruling echelon of the Black Tower's Legion of Asgore. If, at some point, one of the enslaved Infernals should achieve great glory in the eyes of Hashut and the Lord of the Black Fortress, their mask will be torn off, exposing the scarred and ravaged flesh of the redeemed warrior once again to the world. At this point, they may return to Zar Nagrund, free of their past shame, and once more able to reclaim their lives and start anew. A feat that very few ever managed to accomplish. There is an excellent example of this process in the Gotrek and Felix book, The Road of Skulls, in which we see a sorcerer prophet who has an infernal ironsworn guard actually tell his guard that his shame will be erased and he will be seen as anew and redeemed in the eyes of Hashut should he successfully slay Gotrek Gurnison, who at that point in the story is proving to be quite the threat and nuisance to the sorcerer prophet, Of course, being a Gotrek and Felix book, I imagine you can infer how the particular Ironsworn did not necessarily succeed at his task. But as I said earlier, it's a great book to read if you want to learn more about the Chaos Dwarfs. In any event, that is going to be the last question for today's episode. I hope you look forward to the next one, as we will be continuing answering questions within the culture section of the Chaos Dwarf Q&A. So until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you then.